Sometimes the hardest people to deal with aren't strangers. They're the people you once trusted, the people whose approval mattered, the people you kept making excuses for because you wanted to believe there was still something good underneath the hurt. And maybe that's where you've been living lately, trying to understand someone who keeps making you feel small, guilty, confused, or exhausted. You explain yourself. You stay patient. You give another chance, then another, and somehow, after every conversation, you're the one lying awake wondering what you did wrong. But listen carefully. Not every difficult person needs to be defeated. Not every toxic person needs to be exposed. And not every battle deserves your energy. Sometimes the smartest response is much quieter. Welcome back to Focus with Maya. Today, we're talking about the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout. The kind of wisdom that helps you recognize when someone's behavior is no longer something you can fix, and when protecting your peace requires you to stop participating in the same pattern. Because dealing with toxic people isn't simply about learning what to say to them. It's about learning what their behavior is trying to teach you about your own boundaries, your own needs, and the places where you've been abandoning yourself just to keep someone else comfortable. Maybe you've been calling it kindness when it was actually fear. Maybe you've been calling it patience when it was actually self-neglect. And maybe you've been waiting for someone to finally understand your worth when the person who needs to understand it most is you. There's a deeper reason toxic relationships can be so difficult to leave behind, even when you know they're hurting you. And once you understand that reason, you'll begin to see these relationships and yourself very differently. One of the most confusing things about toxic people is that they don't always behave badly. Sometimes they can be warm. Sometimes they can be generous. Sometimes they can make you laugh until your stomach hurts. And then, without warning, they say something that cuts deep, dismiss your feelings, twist your words, or make you question yourself. That's what makes it difficult. If someone were cruel every minute of every day, you wouldn't have to wonder what was happening. But human relationships are rarely that simple. A person can have good qualities and still be unhealthy for you. Someone can love you and still repeatedly hurt you. Someone can have suffered in their own life and still be responsible for the way they treat you. Understanding that distinction can change everything. You don't have to turn someone into a monster before you're allowed to protect yourself. Think about the last time you walked away from a conversation feeling strangely drained. Maybe nothing dramatic happened. There was no screaming, no obvious insult. Just a collection of small moments, the interruption, the sarcastic comment, the way your feelings were brushed aside, the subtle suggestion that everything was somehow your fault. Then you went home and replayed the conversation. Maybe you thought, was I too sensitive? That question can become a dangerous habit, because when you constantly question your own perception, you become easier to control. You begin asking whether your feelings are legitimate instead of asking why you're repeatedly placed in situations that make you feel unsafe, diminished, or unheard. Emotional intelligence doesn't mean doubting yourself endlessly. It means becoming curious about patterns. Pay attention to how you feel around people. Not just how you feel when they're being nice, but how you feel afterward. Do you feel peaceful, or do you feel like you've just survived something? That answer may tell you more than another 100 explanations ever could. And here's where the real work begins. Learning to stop confusing understanding someone with accepting their behavior. Because compassion without boundaries can slowly become a way of hurting yourself. There comes a moment when you realize that explaining yourself is no longer creating understanding. You're speaking clearly, but somehow your words keep coming back to you distorted. You say, that hurt me. They hear you're attacking me. You say, I need some space. They hear you don't care about me. You explain your intentions. You explain your feelings. You explain what happened. And somehow, by the end of the conversation, you're apologizing for something you didn't even do. That is when you have to become very careful, because a healthy relationship makes room for clarification. A toxic pattern turns clarification into a courtroom where you're always the defendant. You shouldn't have to present evidence every time you experience pain. There is a quiet kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly trying to convince another person to treat you with basic consideration. You start choosing every word carefully. You rehearse conversations before having them. You wonder whether sending a simple message will create another argument. And slowly, you become less like yourself. You stop saying what you mean. You stop asking for what you need. You start shrinking your personality to fit inside someone else's emotional comfort zone. That isn't peace. That's self-abandonment. The smarter way to deal with a toxic person is not always to find the perfect sentence that will finally make them understand. Sometimes the smarter response is to recognize that understanding may not be the problem. They may understand you perfectly. They simply may not want to change. That's a painful realization, but it can also be freeing. Because once you stop believing that your perfect explanation will transform someone else's character, you regain control over the one thing you actually can control, your participation. You can choose when to respond. You can choose what information you share. You can choose which arguments you refuse to enter. You can choose to leave a conversation that has become disrespectful. And you can choose silence without feeling guilty for it. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes silence is what happens when you finally realize that your peace doesn't need a defense attorney. If you've spent years trying to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you, ask yourself something tonight. What would change if you stopped explaining and started observing? The answer may reveal the beginning of your freedom. One of the most important lessons you can learn about toxic people is this: you do not have to attend every argument you are invited to. Some people know exactly how to pull you into emotional chaos. They make a comment, and when you react, they focus on your reaction instead of what they said. They change the subject. They bring up something you did 3 years ago. They question your character. Suddenly, the original issue has disappeared, and you're standing there trying to defend your entire existence. Have you ever walked into a conversation intending to solve one problem and walked away feeling like you had to apologize for being alive? That's not communication. That's emotional exhaustion. And the more emotionally invested you are in proving yourself, the easier it becomes for someone else to control the direction of the conversation. This is why boundaries are so powerful. A boundary isn't a threat. It isn't punishment. It isn't "you better change or else." A boundary is simply a decision about what you will participate in. You can say, "I'm willing to talk about this when we can speak respectfully." And if the disrespect continues, you don't have to deliver a 20-minute speech explaining why you're leaving. You leave. You can say, "I'm not comfortable discussing that," and you don't need to follow it with 10 reasons. You can say, "I understand you feel differently," and then stop trying to win. This may feel unnatural at first, especially if you've spent years believing that being a good person means keeping everyone happy. But making someone comfortable at the expense of your own emotional safety isn't kindness. It's a form of self-erasure. There will be people who call your boundaries selfish simply because they benefited from you having none. Let that sink in. Your growth may inconvenience people who were comfortable with the version of you that never said no. That doesn't mean you're becoming cold. It may mean you're becoming honest. And when you begin setting boundaries, something unexpected happens. You discover who respects you even when they don't get what they want, and who only respected you when you were easy to control. That discovery can hurt, but it can also save you years of trying to earn respect from someone who was never offering it freely. There is another trap toxic relationships can create, and it is one of the hardest to recognize because it often disguises itself as loyalty. You keep remembering who that person used to be. You remember the conversations, the laughter, the moments when they showed up for you. You remember the version of them that made you believe the relationship was worth protecting. So when their behavior changes, you don't respond to what is happening now. You respond to what you remember. You think, maybe they'll become that person again. And that hope can keep you standing in a place that has been hurting you for far too long. But people must be judged by patterns, not promises. Anyone can apologize. Anyone can say, "I'll do better." Anyone can become emotional when they feel they're losing access to you. The real question is what happens afterward. Do their actions change? Do they take responsibility without blaming you? Do they respect the boundary you established? Do they make an effort when nobody is watching? Because an apology without changed behavior can become another chapter in the same cycle. This doesn't mean you should become suspicious of everyone. It means you should become observant. There's a difference. Suspicion says everyone will hurt me, Wisdom says, I'll pay attention to how people treat me. And that distinction matters because being hurt doesn't mean you have to become hard. You can remain kind without remaining available to everyone. You can forgive someone without giving them the same access to your life. You can wish someone well and still decide that they no longer belong close to you. Sometimes healing requires grieving a person who is still alive, grieving the relationship you hoped you would have, the conversations you wanted, the love you thought would eventually become mutual. That grief is real. Don't rush through it. Sit with it long enough to understand what you're actually losing. Maybe you're not losing a person. Maybe you're losing an illusion. And strangely enough, that can be the beginning of peace. If you're choosing yourself without becoming bitter, write one word in the comments that describes what you want more of in your life now. Not what you want to prove, not what you want someone else to regret, what you want for yourself. Because the moment your attention moves from their behavior to the life you're building, something inside you begins to change. And that change is where real freedom starts. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do with a toxic person is stop giving them the emotional reaction they've learned to depend on. Think about how a fire behaves when you keep feeding it. It doesn't ask whether the wood is important to you. It simply keeps burning as long as something is available to consume. Some conflicts work the same way. A person provokes you. You defend yourself. They provoke you again. You explain. They twist your explanation. You become frustrated. They point to your frustration and say, see, you're the problem. And now you're trapped inside a cycle where your emotional energy becomes the fuel. This is why emotional control isn't about becoming emotionless. It's about becoming difficult to manipulate. You can feel anger without handing your anger to someone else. You can feel hurt without allowing hurt to make every decision for you. You can be disappointed without immediately reacting. There is a pause between what someone does and what you choose to do next. That pause may be only a few seconds, but it can change your life. When someone says something cruel, you don't always have to answer immediately. Take a breath. Let the first wave pass. Ask yourself, what response will leave me with dignity tomorrow morning? Not what response will make them feel what I feel. That's a different question. One is about protecting your character. The other is about transferring your pain. And you've probably seen what happens when pain gets transferred. Someone hurts you, so you hurt them back. Then they hurt you again. Before long, two wounded people are standing in the same room, each convinced they are defending themselves. You don't have to participate. There is tremendous strength in refusing to become someone you don't recognize just because someone else behaved badly. Maybe they'll accuse you of being cold. Maybe they'll say you've changed. Perhaps you have. Maybe you finally learned that peace isn't something another person gives you. It's something you protect through your choices. And here's the beautiful part. Once you stop reacting automatically, you begin noticing things you couldn't see before. You notice the pattern. You notice the manipulation. You notice your own triggers. And most importantly, you notice how much energy you've been spending trying to control something that was never yours to control. That awareness is going to lead us to an even deeper question. Why did you tolerate certain behavior for so long in the first place? Sometimes the hardest person to forgive isn't the one who hurt you. It's yourself. You look back and wonder, why did I stay? Why didn't I speak up? Why did I keep giving chances? How could I have been so blind? And if you're not careful, healing from another person's behavior can turn into a new form of punishment against yourself. You begin judging the version of you who didn't know what you know now. But you have to remember something important. You made decisions with the information, emotional strength, and understanding you had at the time. Maybe you stayed up because you loved them. Maybe you stayed because you hoped things would change. Maybe you had learned early in life that keeping the peace was safer than telling the truth. Maybe you were afraid of being alone. Maybe you simply didn't know that a boundary could exist without becoming an act of cruelty. Whatever the reason, shame won't rewrite the past. Understanding can. There is a difference between taking responsibility and taking blame. Responsibility says, I can learn from this. Blame says, I am terrible for allowing this to happen. One helps you grow. The other keeps you trapped. Think about someone who has spent years walking on eggshells around another person. Eventually, they may start apologizing for things that don't require an apology. They may explain every decision. They may ask permission to have feelings. Then one day, something small happens. They say no, just one word, no. And perhaps their voice shakes when they say it. But they say it. That moment may look insignificant from the outside. Inside, it can feel enormous because they're not simply refusing a request. They're breaking an old agreement with themselves. The agreement that everyone else's comfort must come before their own. That is how change often begins, not with a dramatic transformation. With one honest sentence, one decision, one moment where you choose not to betray yourself. So stop punishing yourself for the years you spent surviving. Learn from them. You don't have to hate your past to outgrow it. You don't have to hate the person who hurt you to stop allowing them access to you. And you don't have to become fearless before you choose yourself. Courage often arrives after the decision, not before it. You make the decision while your hands are still shaking. Then you discover that you were stronger than you thought. There is a quiet mistake many kind people make when dealing with toxic behavior. They believe they need to prove that they're still good. So they stay patient when they're exhausted. They forgive before they've healed. They keep answering messages they don't want to answer. They keep opening doors that have repeatedly been slammed in their face. And somewhere inside, they fear that choosing distance means becoming cruel. But kindness and access are not the same thing. You can have a compassionate heart and still have a locked door. You can understand someone's pain without volunteering to become the place where they unload it. You can recognize why someone behaves the way they do without accepting the behavior. That distinction is emotional maturity. Imagine a person who has spent years being the emotional emergency room for everyone around them. Whenever someone is angry, they call. Whenever someone is disappointed, they call. Whenever someone needs reassurance, they call. And this person always answers, until one day they don't. Not because they stopped caring, because they finally realized they were caring for everyone except themselves. At first, guilt appears. That's normal. When you've trained people to expect unlimited access to you, healthy limits can feel like wrongdoing. But guilt doesn't always mean you've done something wrong. Sometimes guilt is simply the emotional discomfort of doing something unfamiliar. Let yourself experience that discomfort without immediately obeying it. You don't need to respond to every message. You don't need to explain every decision. You don't need to convince someone that your boundary is reasonable before you're allowed to have it. And you don't need to keep your life open to people simply because you share history. History matters, but history is not a lifetime contract. Some relationships belong to a chapter that has already ended, and there's something deeply peaceful about accepting that. You don't have to rewrite the past. You don't have to pretend the good moments never happened. You simply acknowledge that what once worked may no longer be healthy for who you're becoming. This is where many people discover an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the person you're trying hardest to keep isn't the person you actually need. What you need may be the version of yourself that disappeared while trying to keep that person happy. Find that person again. The one who laughed without checking whether everyone approved. The one who could say no without writing an apology afterward. The one who understood that being loving never required becoming invisible. And once you begin returning to yourself, you'll be ready for one of the most difficult lessons of all. How to let go without letting bitterness become your new home. Letting go is often misunderstood. People imagine that letting go means you stop caring, you stop remembering, you stop feeling the disappointment. But real letting go is much quieter than that. It means you stop allowing what happened to keep deciding who you become, because there is a danger that comes after being hurt. You can become so focused on protecting yourself from the next wound that you accidentally build your entire personality around the last one. You become suspicious of kindness. You question people's intentions. You expect betrayal before trust has even had a chance. And slowly, the person who hurt you begins controlling your life even when they're no longer in it. That's not freedom. Freedom isn't pretending you weren't hurt. It's refusing to let the hurt become your identity. Maybe someone lied to you. That doesn't mean you're foolish. Maybe someone betrayed you. That doesn't mean you're unworthy of loyalty. Maybe someone took your kindness for granted. That doesn't mean kindness was the mistake. The mistake was giving it without discernment. There's a difference. Your heart doesn't need to become harder. It needs to become wiser. You can still love people deeply while watching their actions carefully. You can still believe in people without ignoring evidence. You can still offer forgiveness without offering unlimited access. And perhaps most importantly, you can stop waiting for an apology that may never come. Sometimes closure doesn't arrive in the form of another person's words. Sometimes closure is the moment you stop needing them to understand what they did. You know what happened. You know how it affected you. You know what you will do differently now. That can be enough. Think about how much energy you've spent imagining a conversation where they finally admit everything. They finally say you were right. They finally recognize your value. They finally regret losing you. Maybe that conversation happens someday. Maybe it doesn't. But your healing cannot be dependent on an event you don't control. So give yourself permission to close the door without standing there waiting for someone to knock. And if they do knock, remember, forgiveness doesn't automatically restore access. You can release resentment and still maintain distance. You can wish someone peace from very far away. That's not hatred, that's wisdom. And once you understand that, you begin to realize something extraordinary. Your peace doesn't require everyone to agree with your boundaries. It only requires you to honor them. Tell me in the comments, what are you finally ready to stop carrying for someone else? Sometimes naming the burden is the first step toward putting it down. There is a point in healing when you stop asking, how do I make this person treat me better? And you begin asking a much more important question. How do I build a life that doesn't depend on their behavior? That question changes everything. Because for a long time, you may have been watching someone else's mood like weather. If they're happy, you relax. If they're angry, you become careful. If they approve, you feel valuable. If they criticize you, you question yourself. Your emotional state becomes connected to another person's reactions, and that is an exhausting way to live. You cannot build a peaceful life while constantly checking someone else's temperature. So begin bringing your attention home. What do you need? What kind of conversations leave you feeling respected? What kind of people allow you to be honest without making you afraid? What habits make you feel more grounded? What parts of yourself have you neglected because you were too busy managing somebody else's emotions? These questions may seem simple. They aren't. They force you to confront something many people avoid. Sometimes the person who needs rescuing is not the toxic person. It's you, not because you're weak, because you've been spending your strength in the wrong direction. Imagine spending years trying to convince someone that you're worthy of respect. Now imagine taking all that energy and putting it into your work, your health, your friendships, your creativity, your home, your future. Imagine waking up without immediately wondering who is upset with you. Imagine making a decision without rehearsing how someone else might react. Imagine having a quiet evening where your nervous system doesn't feel like it's waiting for the next conflict. That kind of peace may feel strange at first. You may even mistake it for loneliness. Don't. Sometimes silence feels uncomfortable simply because chaos became familiar. Give yourself time to adjust. Build relationships where you don't have to perform for acceptance. Spend time with people who can disagree without humiliating you. Choose people who celebrate your growth rather than compete with it, and become that kind of person yourself. Because the goal isn't to become so guarded that nobody can reach you. The goal is to become discerning enough to know who deserves closeness. You are not responsible for controlling every toxic person in your life. You are responsible for deciding how much of your life they get to occupy. That is a very different kind of responsibility. And once you understand it, you stop waiting for the world to become gentler before you allow yourself to live peacefully. You begin creating that peace yourself. Eventually, there comes a moment when you realize that protecting your peace isn't about avoiding difficult people. It's about becoming so clear about who you are that difficult people can no longer convince you to abandon yourself. That's a different kind of strength. You may still feel nervous when you set a boundary. You may still feel sad when someone walks away. You may still miss someone who wasn't good for you. You may even question yourself after making the right decision. Healing doesn't mean you become untouched by life. It means you learn how to move through what you feel without letting every emotion dictate your direction. There will be mornings when you feel strong and evenings when you remember everything again. Don't mistake that for failure. A wound can be healing even when it still aches. And sometimes your greatest progress is invisible. It's the message you don't send, the argument you don't continue, the apology you stop begging for, the boundary you keep even when someone tries to make you feel guilty, the moment you realize you don't have to prove your worth to someone who has already decided not to see it. These are quiet victories. Nobody may applaud them. Nobody may even know they happened. But you will. And slowly, your relationship with yourself begins to change. You become someone you can trust. That may be one of the greatest gifts you can give yourself. Because when you trust yourself, you don't need to know exactly what everyone else will do. If someone leaves, you'll know you'll survive. If someone misunderstands you, you'll know your truth doesn't disappear. If someone rejects your boundary, you'll know you can enforce it. If someone chooses not to value you, you'll know their decision does not determine your value. That doesn't mean you stop loving. It means your love